In January 1936, 21-year-old Ann Cooper Hewitt stood in her attorney's office in San Francisco and told assembled reporters that her mother had paid doctors to secretly sterilize her. The operation had been performed 2 years earlier under the pretense of removing her appendix. The reason was money. $4 million. Her father's will stated that if Anne died without children, her 2/3 share of his estate would revert to her mother, Marianne. The mother had ensured the daughter could never have heirs. The trial became a national sensation. Newspapers dubbed it the trial of the century. The New York Times published nearly 50 stories detailing every aspect of the case. Reporters described Anne's childhood, her romances, her spending habits, even her imported French lingerie. The public was riveted by the spectacle of a wealthy socialite mother accused of having her own daughter surgically prevented from bearing children in order to claim an inheritance worth millions. The money at stake had been built by Anne's great-great-grandfather, Peter Cooper, one of America's greatest Gilded Age industrialists. Born in 1791 to a poor hat maker in New York City, Cooper invented the first American steam locomotive, created gelatin dessert, built ironworks and glue factories, and died in 1883, worth approximately $10 million. His grandson, Peter Cooper Hewitt, invented the mercury vapor lamp in 1901 and died in 1921, worth over $4 million. That fortune was now being contested in a San Francisco courtroom in a case that would expose the eugenics movement, family greed, and the vulnerability of women's bodies under American law. Marianne Cooper Hewitt was known in European gambling circles as the greatest woman gambler in the world. She had been married 4 times by the time of the trial. She drank heavily, gambled compulsively, and traveled in royal circles across Europe. When her third husband, Peter Cooper Hewitt, died in 1921 and left most of his money to their daughter Anne, with a clause stating it would revert to Marianne if Anne died childless, the mother reportedly found a solution. She would ensure Anne could never bear children. What followed was a trial that exposed how Gilded Age fortunes destroyed the families who inherited them, how eugenics laws allowed doctors to sterilize women for profit, and how inheritance could motivate the darkest crimes. The case revealed the corruption that wealth breeds across generations, and the lengths to which desperation for money can drive even mothers against daughters. If you are fascinated by how inherited wealth corrupts families and the dark lengths people will go to for money, subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling me which Gilded Age scandal we should investigate next. Now, let us discover how a fortune built through Gilded Age genius led to one of America's most disturbing family betrayals. Chapter 1. Peter Cooper's Gilded Age fortune. In 1791, Peter Cooper was born in a rented room in New York City. His father was a hat maker named John Cooper, who struggled to feed his family. The Coopers moved frequently as John pursued failing business ventures. Young Peter received minimal formal education, perhaps 1 year of schooling total. In 1883, Peter Cooper died as one of America's wealthiest and most respected men, worth approximately $10 million. The fortune he built through invention and industry would eventually destroy his descendants. Peter Cooper's rise embodied the American dream of the early industrial age. At age 17, he was apprenticed to a carriage maker named John Woodward in New York City. He learned the trades of woodworking, metalworking, and mechanical engineering through hands-on experience rather than formal instruction. By age 21, he had saved enough money to purchase Woodward's business and establish himself as an independent craftsman. His first significant fortune came from an unlikely source: glue. In the 1820s, Cooper purchased a glue factory in Manhattan and developed improved methods for producing high-quality adhesive from animal products. The business was unglamorous, but profitable. He reinvested the proceeds into other ventures, always seeking to expand and diversify. In 1830, Cooper achieved his greatest technical triumph. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad needed a locomotive that could navigate the sharp curves of American terrain, which European locomotives could not handle. Cooper designed and built the Tom Thumb, America's first successful steam locomotive. The engine weighed less than 1 ton and could pull carriages at speeds exceeding 10 miles per hour. Though the locomotive itself was not commercially produced, Cooper's design principles revolutionized American railroad engineering. Cooper then turned to iron manufacturing. In the 1840s and 1850s, he He built ironworks in New York and New Jersey that produced rails, beams, and structural iron for America's rapidly expanding infrastructure. His Trenton Iron Company produced the iron beams used in constructing early skyscrapers and bridges. As American cities grew vertically and railroads spread westward, Cooper's iron was embedded in the nation's physical structure. He also invested heavily in Manhattan real estate. Like the Astors and Vanderbilts, Cooper recognized that land in New York City would appreciate as the population exploded. He purchased plots throughout Manhattan, collecting rents and watching values multiply. Unlike many Gilded Age tycoons, however, Cooper maintained relatively modest personal expenditures. He lived comfortably but not extravagantly. Cooper's most enduring legacy was philanthropic. In 1859, he founded the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art in Manhattan. The institution offered free education to working-class students in engineering, architecture, and art. Cooper believed that education was the key to opportunity, and that talent should not be wasted for lack of training. The Cooper Union building still stands today, continuing its mission of providing tuition-free education. He also created one of the world's first commercial gelatin products. In the 1840s, Cooper developed a method for producing powdered gelatin from animal collagen. He patented the process but never successfully marketed it during his lifetime. Years later, another businessman would purchase Cooper's gelatin patent and transform it into a product called Jell-O, earning millions from Cooper's invention. By the 1870s, Peter Cooper's wealth was estimated at between $8 and $10 million. He had invested in telegraph companies, real estate, iron manufacturing, and various other enterprises. He ran for President of the United States in 1876 on the Greenback Party ticket, advocating for currency reform and workers' rights. He lost decisively but used the campaign to promote his progressive economic ideas. Peter Cooper died on April 4, 1883, at age 92. He left behind a fortune estimated at approximately $10 million, numerous industrial enterprises, the Cooper Union, and a reputation as one of America's most innovative and philanthropic industrialists. His children and grandchildren inherited substantial wealth. They did not inherit his work ethic, his inventive genius, or his commitment to using wealth for public good. His daughter Sarah Amelia Cooper had married Abram Stevens Hewitt, who served as mayor of New York City. Their son, Peter Cooper Hewitt, would inherit a portion of the Cooper fortune and would himself become a brilliant inventor. But Peter Cooper Hewitt would also marry a woman named Marion, and together they would produce a daughter named Anne. The Cooper fortune would ultimately be consumed not by philanthropy or industry, but by gambling, legal battles, and a mother's determination to steal her daughter's inheritance through surgical mutilation. Peter Cooper had built something extraordinary through a century of hard work. His descendants would destroy it in decades through greed and neglect. Chapter 2. The Heir Who Invented Light. Peter Cooper Hewitt was born on May 27, 1861, in New York City. He was the grandson of industrialist Peter Cooper and the son of Abram Stevens Hewitt, who would serve as mayor of New York from 1887 to 1888. Young Peter grew up surrounded by wealth, education, and expectations of achievement. He inherited his grandfather's mechanical genius and applied it to the emerging field of electrical engineering. Unlike his grandfather, who had learned through apprenticeship and practical experience, Peter Cooper Hewitt received formal scientific education. He attended Columbia College and studied electrical engineering and physics. By the 1890s, he was conducting experiments in electrical lighting, seeking to improve upon Thomas Edison's incandescent bulb. Edison's bulbs produced light by heating a filament until it glowed, but the process was inefficient, converting much of the electrical energy into heat rather than light. Cooper Hewitt pursued a different approach: vapor lighting. He experimented with passing electrical current through tubes containing mercury vapor, which produced a distinctive blue-green light far more efficiently than incandescent bulbs. In 1901, Cooper Hewitt successfully patented the mercury vapor lamp. The invention revolutionized industrial and commercial lighting. Factories, warehouses, and large commercial spaces adopted the new lamps because they produced more light per watt of electricity than any previous technology. The distinctive blue-green glow became common in industrial settings throughout America and Europe. The patent alone earned Cooper Hewitt over $1 million in licensing fees and royalties. This substantial sum added to the wealth he had inherited from his grandfather's estate and his father's political and business success. By the early 1900s, Peter Cooper Hewitt was a millionaire several times over, combining inherited wealth with earnings from his own inventions. In 1906, at age 45, Peter Cooper Hewitt married a woman named Marion Andrews. She was significantly younger, reportedly in her 20s, and came from a less prominent background. The marriage appears to have been troubled from the beginning. Marion reportedly had expensive tastes, enjoyed gambling, and preferred European society to her husband's scientific circles. Their daughter, Anne Cooper Hewitt, was born on May 14, 1914. Peter Cooper Hewitt continued his scientific work, developing additional inventions and improvements to electrical systems. He maintained laboratories in New York and traveled frequently for business and scientific conferences. The marriage to Marion deteriorated through the 1910s. They separated but did not divorce, maintaining a cordial relationship reportedly for their daughter's sake. Peter Cooper Hewitt continued inventing until shortly before his death. He developed improvements to electrical rectifiers, conducted experiments with radio waves, and consulted for various electrical companies. His mercury vapor lamp had made him wealthy and famous within scientific and industrial circles. On August 25, 1921, Peter Cooper Hewitt died in Paris, France, at age 60. The cause was reportedly related to health complications, though specific details were not widely publicized. His estate was valued at over $4 million, equivalent to approximately $59 million in modern purchasing power. The estate included patents, stock holdings, real estate, and cash assets. The reading of Peter Cooper Hewitt's will took place shortly after his death. The document contained provisions that would ultimately lead to one of America's most disturbing family crimes. The will divided the estate as follows: 1/3 to his widow, Marion Cooper Hewitt, and 2/3 to his daughter, Anne Cooper Hewitt, who was 7 years old at the time of her father's death. But the will contained a critical clause. If Anne died without having children, her 2/3 share would revert entirely to her mother, Marion. This provision was likely intended to keep the family wealth consolidated if Anne died young or chose not to marry. The testator could not have imagined that it would motivate Anne's mother to pay doctors to secretly sterilize her own daughter to ensure she could never have heirs. Marion received approximately $1,300,000 immediately. Anne's 2/3, approximately $2,600,000, was placed in trust. She would receive income from the trust during her minority and would gain full control when she turned 21, unless she died without children, in which case every dollar would go to her mother. The will was probated. The trust was established. Marion took her money and resumed her travels across Europe, gambling at casinos from Monte Carlo to Biarritz. Anne was left with nurses and governesses, a wealthy orphan whose inheritance would make her the target of her own mother's greed. Chapter 3. The Mother. Marion Cooper Hewitt had been married at least 4 times by 1936, though exact details of her early marriages remain unclear in historical records. Her maiden name was reportedly Marion Andrews. Her first marriage was to a man named Brugiere, which ended in divorce. Her second marriage was to someone named Denning, also ending in divorce. Her third marriage was to Peter Cooper Hewitt in 1906, which ended with his death in 1921. She would later marry a man named Derlange, divorcing him as well, and finally marry someone named McCarter. Throughout these marriages and divorces, Marion developed a reputation in American and European high society as a woman of expensive tastes, questionable morals, and extraordinary gambling habits. European casino operators knew her as a high-stakes player who would wager thousands of dollars in single evenings. American newspapers would later describe her as the greatest woman gambler in the world, a title she apparently did not dispute. After Peter Cooper Hewitt's death in 1921, Marion inherited approximately $1,300,000. This was a substantial fortune, enough to generate comfortable income for life if managed conservatively. Marion did not manage it conservatively. She immediately resumed her pattern of European travel, luxury hotel living, and compulsive gambling. Contemporary accounts suggest she frequented the casinos of Monte Carlo, Biarritz, Cannes, and other European gambling centers. She would reportedly lose tens of thousands of dollars in single trips. The losses mounted steadily through the 1920s, She also spent heavily on clothing, jewelry, hotel suites, and entertaining companions in European high society. Her daughter, Anne, was largely an afterthought in this lifestyle. Marion employed nurses and governesses to care for the child while she traveled. When Anne was brought along on European trips, she was often left with staff at hotels while her mother gambled through the night. Nurses who later testified in court described Anne as a lonely, isolated child whose mother showed little affection or interest in her welfare. By the early 1930s, Marion's financial situation was becoming precarious. The $1,300,000 she had inherited was diminishing rapidly. The Great Depression had reduced investment returns. Her gambling losses continued. Her expensive lifestyle consumed wealth faster than her investments could generate income. She was approaching the point where she might have to reduce her standard of living significantly. Meanwhile, Anne was approaching 21, the age at which she would gain control of her two-thirds share of her father's estate, approximately $2,600,000 plus accumulated interest. Marion looked at her daughter's impending inheritance with growing desperation. If Anne lived and had children, Marion would never see that money. Her one-third would run out within years at her current spending rate. But Peter Cooper Hewitt's will contained that critical clause. If Anne died without issue, the two-thirds reverted to Marion. This provision offered a potential solution to Marion's financial problems. If Anne could be prevented from ever having children, then when Anne eventually died, the entire estate would belong to Marion. Reports suggest Marion became increasingly paranoid about Anne's interest in young men as the girl entered her late teens and early 20s. Any sign that Anne might marry and have children represented a threat to Marion's financial future. Marion allegedly began spreading stories that Anne was mentally unstable, promiscuous, and incapable of being a proper mother. She consulted with doctors about having Anne declared incompetent. The eugenics movement of the 1920s and 30s provided Marion with an opportunity. California and other states had passed laws authorizing the sterilization of people deemed feeble-minded or unfit to reproduce. Over 10,000 individuals had been sterilized in California institutions by the mid-1930s. The practice extended to private medical facilities as well. Marion reportedly conceived a plan. She would have Anne examined by psychiatrists who would declare her mentally deficient. She would then arrange for Anne to be sterilized, ostensibly for the girl's own protection and for the good of society. With Anne unable to have children, the inheritance clause would be triggered. Marion would simply have to wait for Anne's eventual death to claim the full estate. In August 1934, Marion put her plan into action. The consequences would expose her as one of the most ruthless mothers in American history. Chapter 4. The Heiress. Anne Cooper Hewitt was 7 years old when her father, Peter Cooper Hewitt, died in Paris in August 1921. She barely knew him. Her parents had separated when she was young, and her father's scientific work kept him traveling frequently. Her clearest early memories were not of her father, but of the succession of nurses and governesses who raised her while her mother, Marion, gambled and traveled across Europe. Anne's childhood was materially privileged but emotionally impoverished. She lived in luxury hotels, wore expensive clothing, and wanted for nothing in terms of physical comfort. But she was profoundly lonely. Marion kept her isolated from other children, moving frequently between Paris, London, New York, and San Francisco. Anne had no stable home, no lasting friendships, no sense of security beyond the ever-changing hotel rooms and the rotating staff hired to supervise her. Her education was irregular and incomplete. Rather than attending proper schools, Anne was taught by a series of private tutors. She learned French and Italian, studied literature and history, and received instruction in music and art. But her learning was fragmented, interrupted by Marion's travel schedule and whims. Contemporary assessments suggest Anne was intelligent and cultured, capable of reading sophisticated literature and conversing in multiple languages, but lacking the systematic education that proper schooling would have provided. Marion's treatment of her daughter appears to have been neglectful at best and abusive at worst. Nurses who later testified described Marion coming home at 4 o'clock in the morning after nights of drinking and gambling, waking Anne to berate her, telling the child that if Anne died, Marion would have all the money. One nurse testified that she had been hired to care for what she was told was a mentally unstable patient, but formed an entirely different opinion within hours of meeting Anne. The nurse observed 3 months of abuse. Anne kept in pajamas upstairs, her letters censored, her telephone calls monitored. Despite this treatment, Anne reportedly remained hopeful about eventually developing a normal relationship with her mother. She wrote affectionate letters to Marion when they were separated. She sought approval and attention. These normal desires for maternal love would be used against her in the trial, presented as evidence of Anne's emotional instability and dependence. By the early 1930s, Anne was approaching adulthood. She was nearing 21, the age when she would gain control of her inheritance. She began expressing interest in young men, attending social events, and contemplating an independent life. For Marion, these developments represented a threat. If Anne married and had children, the inheritance clause would never be triggered. Marion would never get the 2/3. Marion's response was to begin constructing a narrative of Anne's unfitness. She told doctors that Anne was promiscuous, mentally unstable, and incapable of proper judgment. She arranged consultations with psychiatrists sympathetic to eugenic theories. These doctors would ask Anne questions designed to elicit responses that could be interpreted as evidence of mental deficiency. One doctor asked Anne basic civics questions and interpreted her hesitant answers as proof of feeble-mindedness, though Anne's hesitation may simply have reflected nervousness or confusion about why she was being questioned. Anne was unaware of the trap being laid. She trusted that her mother, whatever her faults, had Anne's best interests at heart. She cooperated with medical examinations, believing they were routine health checks. She answered psychiatrists' questions honestly, not realizing that her responses were being recorded as evidence to justify sterilization. In August 1934, Anne was 20 years old. She was approximately 1 year away from gaining control of millions of dollars. She was beginning to imagine a future of independence, perhaps marriage, certainly escape from her mother's control. She had no idea that within days, her mother would arrange to have her surgically mutilated to steal her inheritance. Chapter 5. The Secret Operation. On a summer day in August 1934, Ann Cooper Hewitt was having lunch with her mother Marion at the Coronado Beach Resort near San Diego, California. During the meal, Anne complained of sudden stomach pains. The pain intensified rapidly. Marion appeared concerned and immediately arranged for their driver to rush them back to San Francisco, more than 100 miles north. A doctor was waiting. Dr. Tilton Tillman was Marion's personal physician. He met Anne at the Dante Sanatorium on Broadway in San Francisco. Upon Anne's arrival, Tillman greeted her with a diagnosis already formed. "Well, Anne, I understand you have appendicitis." According to Anne's later testimony, Tillman never examined her abdomen. He did not palpate the standard points where appendicitis pain manifests. He did not take her temperature or check for rebound tenderness. He simply stated that she had appendicitis and would need immediate surgery. Before taking Anne to the operating room, Tillman led her to another room where a psychiatrist named Mary Scally was waiting. Scally proceeded to question Anne. The questions were ostensibly to assess mental competency, but appeared designed to create a record of mental deficiency. Scally asked Anne civics questions. Why did the Pilgrims come to America? Who was the current president? What were the branches of government? Anne, confused and in pain, answered haltingly. She may have been unsure why she was being questioned about history and government when she was supposedly suffering from appendicitis. Her hesitant responses were recorded by Scally as evidence of mental impairment. Scally would later sign documents declaring Anne to be feeble-minded and therefore an appropriate candidate for sterilization under California's eugenics sterilization law. A second doctor, Samuel Boyd, joined Tillman in examining Anne and confirming the appendicitis diagnosis. Like Tillman, Boyd was reportedly on Marion's payroll. Both doctors had been paid in advance to perform not just an appendectomy but a salpingectomy, the surgical removal of the fallopian tubes, which would permanently prevent Anne from bearing children. Anne was prepared for surgery. She was told she would wake up without her troublesome appendix. She was administered anesthesia and lost consciousness. While Anne was unconscious, the doctors performed the operation they had been paid to conduct. They made an incision and removed her fallopian tubes. They may or may not have also removed her appendix to maintain the pretense. The salpingectomy was complete and irreversible. Anne would never be able to conceive children. Anne woke in a hospital room and was told the appendectomy had been successful. She would need to remain in the sanatorium for several weeks to recover. During her recovery, nurses attended to her. Several of these nurses later reported noticing something unusual. The surgical scar did not match the typical pattern for an appendectomy. The incision was in the wrong location, oriented differently than standard appendix removal procedures. But they said nothing at the time, intimidated by Marion Cooper Hewitt's wealth and authority. One nurse, Grace Wilkins, became particularly suspicious. She had been told she would be caring for a mentally incompetent patient, but found Anne to be entirely lucid and normal. She observed Marion treating Anne cruelly, keeping her confined to her room, censoring her mail, and monitoring her telephone calls. Wilkins would later receive a letter from Marion's attorney warning her not to discuss what she had observed. She would also reportedly receive a threatening phone call telling her she would be killed if she testified in any legal proceedings. Anne recovered from the surgery over several weeks. She experienced the normal post-operative pain and discomfort. She noticed the scar, but had no reason to question what she had been told. When she was released from the sanatorium, she resumed her controlled existence under Marion's supervision, unaware that she had been permanently sterilized. For nearly 2 years, Anne did not know what had been done to her. Marion's plan appeared to have succeeded completely. Anne could never have children. When Anne eventually died, whether at age 30, 50, or 80, she would die childless. The inheritance clause in Peter Cooper Hewitt's will would be triggered. The full estate would belong to Marion. But in late 1935, Anne began experiencing health issues that prompted her to consult an independent physician. The truth was about to emerge. Chapter 6. The Discovery. In late 1935, more than a year after her supposed appendectomy, Anne Cooper Hewitt consulted a physician for a routine medical examination. The doctor was not one of her mother's associates. He asked about her medical history. Anne mentioned the appendectomy performed in August 1934. The doctor asked to see the surgical scar. Anne showed him the scar on her lower abdomen. The doctor examined it carefully. His expression changed. He asked questions about the operation, about where it had been performed, about what symptoms had led to it. Then, he told Anne something that would change her life. That scar was not from an appendectomy. The location was wrong. The incision pattern was inconsistent with appendix removal. The doctor conducted further examination. He discovered that Anne's fallopian tubes were absent. She had undergone a salpingectomy. The doctor explained what this meant. Anne had been sterilized. She could never become pregnant. She could never have children. The operation had been permanent and irreversible. Anne was reportedly shocked into silence. She struggled to comprehend what she was being told. Why would doctors have sterilized her? She had agreed only to appendix removal. She had not consented to sterilization. She had not even known such a procedure had been performed. The doctor had no answers, only the medical evidence of what had been done to her body without her knowledge or consent. Anne confronted her mother. The details of this confrontation were not fully disclosed in later court proceedings, but the substance was clear. Marion initially denied any knowledge, then shifted to justification. She claimed it had been done for Anne's own good. She said Anne had been declared feeble-minded by competent psychiatrists. She insisted the sterilization was legal under California law and necessary to protect Anne and society from the consequences of Anne's alleged promiscuity and mental deficiency. Anne must have realized in that moment what her mother had done and why. The inheritance clause in her father's will was the only logical motive. Marion had arranged the sterilization to ensure Anne could never have children, thereby guaranteeing that when Anne died, the full estate would revert to Marion. Her mother had mutilated her to steal millions of dollars. Anne consulted an attorney named Russell P. Tyler in San Francisco. Tyler was experienced in inheritance law and civil litigation. Anne told him what had happened. Tyler immediately recognized the potential legal claims: fraud, conspiracy, assault, battery, and possibly mayhem under California criminal law. He also recognized the enormous publicity the case would generate. Tyler investigated. He obtained Anne's medical records from the Dante Sanatorium. He found documentation of the salpingectomy. He found the psychiatric evaluation by Mary Scally, declaring Anne to be feeble-minded. He found evidence of payments from Marion to doctors Tillman and Boyd. He interviewed nurses who had attended Anne after the surgery. He built a case. In December 1935, Tyler advised Anne to pursue both civil and criminal remedies. She could sue her mother and the doctors for monetary damages. She could also file criminal complaints for conspiracy to commit mayhem. Tyler understood that the case would expose Anne's private life to public scrutiny. Every detail of her childhood, her relationships, her behavior would be examined and judged by newspapers and the public. Anne would be subjected to invasive questions and humiliating publicity. Anne decided to proceed. The money mattered, certainly. But more than the financial compensation, Anne wanted justice. She wanted her mother and the doctors punished for what they had done. She wanted the world to know that a mother had sterilized her own daughter to steal an inheritance. She wanted other women protected from similar abuse. On January 6, 1936, Russell P. Tyler called a press conference at his San Francisco office. Anne Cooper Hewitt sat beside him, wearing rouge and fur. Photographers' bulbs flashed. Reporters leaned forward with notebooks ready. Tyler announced that Anne was suing her mother, Marion Cooper Hewitt, Dr. Tilton Tillman, and Dr. Samuel Boyd, for $500,000. The charge: conspiracy to sterilize Anne without her consent in order to deprive her of her inheritance. The scandal that would captivate America for the next year had begun. Chapter 7. The trial begins. The announcement on January 7, 1936, that Anne Cooper Hewitt was suing her mother for $500,000, claiming she had been secretly sterilized to steal an inheritance, created an immediate sensation. Newspapers across the country printed the story on front pages. The New York Times, which would eventually publish nearly 50 articles about the case, ran detailed accounts of Anne's accusations. The public was transfixed by multiple elements of the scandal. First was the sheer audacity of a mother paying doctors to sterilize her own daughter. Second was the inheritance motive, $4 million at stake, with the wills clause making Anne's childlessness financially beneficial to Marion. Third was the involvement of the eugenics movement in California's sterilization laws. Fourth was the salacious details: Marion's gambling, her multiple marriages, her alleged abuse of Anne, and Anne's own romantic life. The lawsuit named 3 defendants: Marion Cooper Hewitt, Dr. Tilton Tillman, and Dr. Samuel Boyd. The claims included conspiracy, fraud, assault, battery, and infliction of emotional distress. Anne sought $500,000 in compensatory and punitive damages. Her attorney, Russell P. Tyler, argued that the defendants had conspired to deprive Anne of her fundamental right to bear children and had done so purely for financial gain. Almost immediately, San Francisco District Attorney Matthew Brady became interested in the case. After reading Anne's accusations in the newspapers, Brady consulted with his assistant August Fortner and police inspector George Engler. They researched California's sterilization laws and discovered that while over 10,000 people had been sterilized in public institutions since the law's passage in 1909, there was no accurate record of sterilizations performed in private practice. The legal experts predicted the number might be in the thousands. Brady recognized that Anne's case could set important legal precedent. If a wealthy young white woman from a prominent family could be sterilized without her knowledge or consent for financial motives, then the law offered no protection to anyone. Brady decided to pursue criminal charges in addition to Anne's civil lawsuit. In February 1936, he filed mayhem charges against Marion Cooper Hewitt, Dr. Tillman, and Dr. Boyd. Mayhem was defined under California law as the unlawful and malicious removal of a member of another person's body. The question would be whether sterilization through removal of fallopian tubes constituted mayhem. The criminal case would proceed separately from the civil case, though they would run roughly parallel through 1936. The civil trial began with Anne's testimony. She took the stand and described her childhood under Marion's negligent and abusive care. She recounted being woken at 4 a.m. by her drunken mother and being told that if she died, Marion would have all her money. She described the isolation, the censored letters, the monitored phone calls. She testified about the sudden stomach pain at Coronado Beach, the rush to San Francisco, the diagnosis of appendicitis without proper examination. Anne's testimony was emotional but composed. She described waking from surgery, believing her appendix had been removed. She recounted the years of not knowing what had truly been done to her. She described the moment the independent doctor told her she had been sterilized. She testified that she had never consented to sterilization, had never been told it was being performed, and had been completely unaware of the procedure until more than a year later. The defense attorneys attacked Anne's credibility immediately. They presented her as promiscuous, mentally unstable, and incapable of being a fit mother. They introduced the psychiatric evaluation by Mary Scally, declaring Anne feeble-minded. They argued that the sterilization had been performed legally under California's eugenics sterilization law to protect both Anne and society from the consequences of her reproducing. The inheritance motive was dismissed as irrelevant. The procedure had been medically necessary regardless of financial considerations. Nurse Grace Wilkins provided crucial testimony for the prosecution. She stated that she had been hired to care for a mental patient but had found Anne to be entirely normal within 30 minutes of meeting her. Wilkins testified about observing 3 months of abuse by Marion. Anne kept upstairs in pajamas, her correspondence censored, her telephone conversations monitored. Wilkins described Anne as an intelligent young woman being held prisoner by a cruel and neglectful mother. Wilkins also testified that she had received threatening communications. A letter from Marion's attorney had warned her not to discuss the case. She had received a telephone call from an unidentified person threatening her with death if she testified. These intimidation attempts backfaded, making Marion appear even more guilty. The defendants presented their own witnesses. Psychiatrist Mary Scally testified that she had conducted a proper evaluation and had legitimately concluded that Anne was feeble-minded. She cited Anne's hesitant answers to civics questions and her alleged promiscuous behavior as evidence of mental deficiency. Doctors Tillman and Boyd testified that they had performed the sterilization based on proper medical and psychiatric assessments and in accordance with California law. The trial exposed the mechanics of eugenics sterilization. Under California law, individuals deemed unfit to reproduce could be sterilized with the authorization of medical professionals and institution administrators. The law had originally been intended to apply to persons in state institutions for the insane or feeble-minded. But by the 1930s, the practice had expanded to private facilities. Doctors exercised broad discretion in determining who qualified as unfit. The case also exposed the financial incentives for abuse. Marion had reportedly paid Doctors Tillman and Boyd substantial sums. The exact amounts were disputed, but the existence of payments beyond normal medical fees was not. The doctors had a financial motive to perform the sterilization regardless of medical necessity. As the civil trial proceeded through the winter and spring of 1936, the criminal mayhem case moved toward its own trial date. The nation watched both proceedings with fascination. The case had become a referendum not just on what Marion had done, but on eugenics itself, on women's reproductive rights, and on the vulnerability of even wealthy women to medical and legal abuse. Chapter 8. The Eugenics Defense. The defense of Marion Cooper Hewitt and the two doctors rested fundamentally on a single argument. The sterilization of Anne Cooper Hewitt had been legal under California law and medically appropriate under the principles of the eugenics movement. This defense exposed the full scope of America's eugenics sterilization program and the pseudo-scientific racism and classism that underpinned it. California had passed its sterilization law in 1909, one of the first states to do so. The law authorized the sterilization of inmates in state institutions who were deemed insane, feeble-minded, or afflicted with hereditary defects that could be passed to offspring. The ostensible purpose was to improve the human race by preventing those with inferior traits from reproducing. By 1936, over 10,000 individuals had been sterilized in California's public institutions. The state had sterilized more people than any other jurisdiction in America. The eugenics movement had originated in late 19th century Britain and had gained substantial support in early 20th century America. Proponents argued that human traits like intelligence, criminality, poverty, and morality were primarily hereditary, and that society could be improved through selective breeding. They advocated preventing the unfit from reproducing while encouraging the fit to have more children. Leading American eugenicists followed the Cooper-Hewitt case with intense interest. Paul Popenoe and Ezra Gosney, who ran the Human Betterment Foundation in California, saw the trial as an opportunity to expand the legal grounds for sterilization. If the courts ruled that sterilization was legal even in cases of alleged promiscuity rather than demonstrable mental deficiency, then the category of sterilizable persons could be vastly expanded. The defense presented expert testimony about eugenic theory. Witnesses testified that feeble-mindedness was hereditary and that allowing feeble-minded persons to reproduce would degrade the genetic quality of the population. They argued that Anne's alleged promiscuity and poor judgment were symptoms of inherited mental deficiency. They claimed that her mother Marion's gambling and multiple marriages demonstrated that the family carried defective genes. This argument revealed a fundamental contradiction in eugenics. If Marion's behavior proved genetic defectiveness, then Marion herself should have been sterilized to prevent passing those genes to children. But the eugenicists conveniently focused only on Anne, not on her mother, who exhibited even more extreme behaviors. The logic was incoherent, revealing that eugenic theory was simply a pseudoscientific justification for controlling women deemed socially undesirable. Anne's attorneys countered with their own expert witnesses. They presented evidence of Anne's intelligence and education. Witnesses testified that Anne could speak French and Italian fluently. She read sophisticated literature, including works by Shakespeare, Charles Dickens, and historical biographies of Napoleon and Marie Antoinette. She demonstrated cultural knowledge and intellectual capacity far exceeding any reasonable definition of feeble-mindedness. The defense argued that Anne's problems, to the extent they existed, stemmed from her mother's abuse and neglect rather than from genetic defects. A child raised in isolation, subjected to emotional cruelty, denied proper education and socialization, would naturally exhibit some difficulties. But these were environmental factors, not hereditary ones. Anne's attorneys argued that if anyone in the family exhibited unfitness for parenthood, it was Marion, who had abused and neglected her daughter throughout childhood. Neither side in the civil case questioned the fundamental legitimacy of eugenic sterilization itself. Anne's attorneys did not argue that forced sterilization was inherently wrong or that the California law was unconstitutional. They argued only that Anne had been misclassified as feeble-minded and that the procedure had been performed without her knowledge or consent. They accepted the premise that genuinely feeble-minded persons could legitimately be sterilized to prevent reproduction. This limitation in the civil case reflected the political reality of 1936 America. Eugenics enjoyed broad support among educated elites, progressive reformers, and medical professionals. Challenging the movement directly would have been politically difficult and possibly counterproductive. Anne's attorneys chose the narrower argument. She personally did not qualify for sterilization, even if sterilization in general was acceptable. The criminal mayhem case raised different legal issues. Mayhem required proving that a body member had been unlawfully removed. The defense argued that sterilization did not constitute mayhem because it did not remove an external member or desexualize the victim. Anne could still engage in sexual activity. She simply could not conceive children. Under this interpretation, sterilization was not mayhem. The prosecutors countered that the fallopian tubes were body members and their removal was unlawful because Anne had not consented and was not legitimately classified as feeble-minded. They argued that the procedure had been performed for financial motives rather than medical or eugenic purposes, making it criminal regardless of California's sterilization law. The legal arguments in both trials ultimately centered on narrow technical questions rather than fundamental rights. Could a woman be sterilized based on allegations of promiscuity? Did sterilization constitute mayhem under criminal law? Had proper procedures been followed in declaring Anne feeble-minded? The broader question of whether any woman should be sterilized without her full, informed consent remained largely unaddressed. As both trials moved toward verdicts in the summer of 1936, the eugenics movement waited anxiously. Leaders like Popenoe hoped for rulings that would expand their power to sterilize women deemed morally unfit. Reformers hoped for verdicts that would expose the abuses inherent in the system. The decisions would have implications far beyond one family's dispute over millions of dollars. Chapter 9. The Verdict. On August 28, 1936, after weeks of testimony and days of jury deliberation in the criminal mayhem trial, the California Court of Appeals issued its ruling. The mayhem charges against Doctors Tilton, Tillman, and Samuel Boyd were dismissed. The court held that sterilization did not constitute mayhem under California law because it did not remove an essential body member and did not deprive the victim of the ability to engage in sexual relations. The operation had removed only the capacity to reproduce, not any fundamental bodily function as mayhem required. The decision stunned prosecutors and reformers. District Attorney Matthew Brady and his assistant August Fortner had believed they had a strong case. The evidence showed that Anne had not consented, had not been properly evaluated, and had been sterilized primarily for financial rather than medical reasons. But the court ruled that regardless of motive or consent, The procedure itself was not criminal mayhem. Doctors Tillman and Boyd walked free. No criminal penalties, no professional sanctions. They had been paid by Marion to sterilize her daughter, and the law provided no remedy. The ruling meant that doctors in California could sterilize women with minimal oversight as long as they claimed eugenic justifications. The criminal charges against Marion Cooper Hewitt were also dismissed. Marion had remained in New Jersey throughout the proceedings, refusing to return to California to face trial. California authorities had sought her extradition, but New Jersey refused to comply. With the charges against the doctors dismissed, there was no point in continuing to pursue Marion for conspiracy. She would never face criminal prosecution for arranging her daughter's sterilization. The civil lawsuit reached a different conclusion, but an unsatisfying one. Rather than proceed to a jury verdict that might have vindicated Anne publicly, the parties reached an out-of-court settlement. The exact terms were not publicly disclosed, but reports suggested Anne received a monetary payment substantially less than the $500,000 she had sought. The settlement likely included confidentiality provisions preventing the parties from discussing the details. Anne obtained some financial compensation, but no public vindication. She did not receive a jury verdict declaring that what her mother had done was wrong. She did not receive a judgment that could serve as precedent protecting other women. She received money and silence. For the eugenics movement, the verdicts represented complete victory. Paul Popeno wrote to one of the defense attorneys, "May I join my congratulations to the flood of them which I am sure you have been receiving, for your smashing victory, which the appellate court seems now to have made complete." Eugenicists celebrated that the case had established sterilization was not criminal mayhem and could be performed based on broad definitions of present unfitness, including alleged promiscuity or moral deficiency. The rulings expanded the power of doctors and institutions to sterilize women without meaningful oversight. The requirement that subjects be genuinely feeble-minded was weakened. A woman could now be sterilized if she was deemed morally unfit based on behaviors like drinking, promiscuity, or disobedience. The decision made thousands of additional women vulnerable to forced sterilization. For reformers and women's rights advocates, the verdicts were devastating. They had hoped the Cooper Hewitt case would expose the abuses of eugenic sterilization and lead to stronger protections. Instead, the case had strengthened the eugenics movement and demonstrated that even wealthy white women from prominent families had no legal protection against forced sterilization. The case did have one significant impact. It exposed to the American public the extent of eugenic sterilization practices. Before the Cooper Hewitt trial, most Americans were unaware that over 60,000 people nationwide had been sterilized under state laws. The publicity surrounding Anne's case educated the public about these programs and the questionable science behind them. The trial also coincided with growing awareness of Nazi Germany's eugenic programs. The Nazis had based their sterilization and euthanasia programs on American models, including California's laws. As reports of Nazi atrocities reached America through the late 1930s, Americans became increasingly uncomfortable with the realization that their own country had pioneered eugenic sterilization. The Cooper Hewitt case contributed to this growing unease. But legal change would come slowly. Eugenic sterilizations continued in California and other states through the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. The Supreme Court case Skinner v. Oklahoma in 1942 struck down some compulsory sterilization laws on equal protection grounds, but the practice continued in modified forms. Over 64,000 Americans would ultimately be sterilized under eugenic laws before the programs finally ended. Anne Cooper Hewitt received her settlement money. Her mother Marion returned to her life of gambling and dissolution. The doctors resumed their medical practices. No one was punished. The system that had enabled a mother to sterilize her daughter for inheritance remained intact. Chapter 10. The Aftermath and Legacy. Anne Cooper Hewitt lived another 20 years after the trial concluded in 1936. She died in 1956 at age 42. She never married. She never had children. The operation her mother had arranged when Anne was 20 ensured she would die childless, exactly as the inheritance clause in her father's will had specified. The details of Anne's life between 1936 and her death in 1956 are not extensively documented in public records. She apparently continued fighting legal battles over her inheritance, seeking full control of the trust fund that had been established when her father died. The battles were costly, consuming portions of the very wealth she was fighting to protect. Anne maintained a low profile after the spectacular publicity of the trial. She had been subjected to months of invasive press coverage during which every detail of her life was exposed and judged. Reporters had described her childhood, her romantic relationships, her personal habits, even her French lingerie. The experience was humiliating and traumatic. She apparently chose to live quietly afterward, avoiding the publicity that had made her famous. Anne never publicly reconciled with her mother, but she did attend Marianne's funeral. Marianne Cooper Hewitt had attempted suicide in February 1936 during the height of the trial, reportedly by overdosing on medication at the Plaza Hotel in New York. She survived but never fully recovered her health. She died in 1939 at approximately age 47, her body and mind destroyed by decades of alcohol, stress, and guilt. Despite everything Marianne had done to her, Anne traveled east to mourn at her mother's graveside. Perhaps Anne recognized her mother as another victim of inherited wealth and the corrupting desperation for money. The inheritance that had motivated the entire tragedy was ultimately dispersed through legal fees, settlements, and estate administration. The $4 million that Peter Cooper Hewitt left in 1921 was substantially depleted by the time Anne died in 1956. Legal battles, the civil settlement, taxes, and normal expenditures consumed much of the wealth. When Anne died without children, the remaining assets were distributed to other Cooper family members and charitable organizations, according to complex trust provisions. None of Peter Cooper's fortune remains concentrated today. The Cooper Union, which Peter Cooper founded in 1859, continues to operate as a prestigious institution providing education in art, architecture, and engineering. But it is supported by diverse funding sources, not by Cooper family wealth. The Cooper name survives primarily through the institution that bears it, not through dynastic wealth or family prominence. The Cooper Hewitt case had lasting impact on the eugenics movement, despite the immediate victories that movement claimed in 1936. The publicity surrounding Anne's trial exposed eugenic sterilization to broader public scrutiny. Americans learned that over 60,000 of their fellow citizens had been sterilized, often without understanding or meaningful consent. The pseudoscientific justifications for these programs began to be questioned. The rise of Nazi Germany accelerated the decline of American eugenics. The Nazis explicitly cited American eugenic programs, particularly California's sterilization laws, as models for their own racial hygiene programs. As Nazi atrocities became known through the late 1930s and during World War II, Americans grew increasingly uncomfortable with their association with eugenic ideology. What had seemed like progressive science in the 1920s came to be seen as dangerous pseudoscience by the 1940s. In 1942, the Supreme Court decided Skinner v. Oklahoma, which struck down an Oklahoma law authorizing sterilization of habitual criminals on equal protection grounds. The decision did not outlaw eugenic sterilization entirely, but it imposed constitutional limits on states' power to sterilize citizens. Justice William O. Douglas wrote that the right to reproduce was one of the basic civil rights of man and could not be denied arbitrarily. Despite Skinner, eugenic sterilizations continued in many states through the 1960s and 70s, particularly targeting poor women, minority women, and incarcerated women. The programs gradually declined as the scientific basis for eugenics was discredited and as civil rights movements challenged the racism and classism inherent in the practice. California performed its last eugenic sterilization in 1979. By then, over 64,000 Americans had been sterilized under state eugenic laws. The Cooper Hewitt case remains one of the clearest examples of how eugenic laws could be abused for private financial gain. While most sterilizations were performed on poor or institutionalized persons, Anne's case demonstrated that even wealthy women from prominent families were vulnerable. The existence of eugenic laws created opportunities for exploitation that extended far beyond the movement's stated goals of racial betterment. The case also illustrates the mathematical inevitability of inherited wealth's corruption. Peter Cooper built his fortune through invention, industry, and hard work over 7 decades, from 1791 to 1863. His grandson, Peter Cooper Hewitt, expanded it through scientific genius and created the mercury vapor lamp that revolutionized lighting. But by the third and fourth generations, the wealth had become a source of corruption rather than creation. Marion Cooper Hewitt represented the ultimate expression of this corruption, a person who had contributed nothing to the fortune's creation, but who was willing to mutilate her own daughter to claim more of it. The inheritance clause in Peter Cooper Hewitt's will, intended to keep family wealth consolidated, instead created perverse incentives that led directly to Anne's sterilization. The pattern repeats across wealthy families. Fortunes built through genius or ruthless efficiency in one generation become sources of conflict, corruption, and destruction in later generations. The Vanderbilts, Astors, Guggenheims, and dozens of other Gilded Age dynasties saw their wealth dissipate across 3 or 4 generations through division, spending, legal battles, and poor management. The Cooper fortune followed the same trajectory. What makes the Cooper-Hewitt case particularly dark is not the mere dissipation of wealth, but the specific crime it motivated. Other wealthy families fought in court over money. The Cooper-Hewitts fought in court over whether a mother could legally sterilize her daughter to steal an inheritance. The case stands as perhaps the most disturbing example of how inherited wealth can corrupt family relationships and motivate unspeakable acts. Anne Cooper Hewitt died in 1956, denied the children and family she might have had. Marion Cooper Hewitt died in 1939, consumed by guilt and alcohol. Peter Cooper Hewitt's fortune was dispersed and forgotten. Peter Cooper's fortune, built over a lifetime of invention and industry, was consumed within 75 years. What remains is the institution he founded, Cooper Union, which continues educating students in art, architecture, and engineering as he intended. The lesson of the Cooper-Hewitt case is clear and disturbing. Inherited wealth corrupts. Fortunes built through genius in one generation become sources of greed, crime, and family destruction in later generations. The money that Peter Cooper accumulated through innovation, and that his grandson, Peter Cooper Hewitt, expanded through scientific discovery, was ultimately consumed by legal fees, gambling losses, and the costs of defending a mother who sterilized her daughter for millions of dollars. No dynasty was established, no legacy preserved. Only the scandal remains.